Okay, welcome. We're gonna get started now that Wayne White's walked in the door. We're set. Welcome, Wayne. Come on, come on, come on in. Hi, my name's Jody Bickel. I'm CEO and founder of Creekbank Associates, and here in the environmental market, across environmental markets, we are not project developers or bankers, but we have that practitioner lens, so we end up advising various industries and agencies in their strategy on environmental markets. And in that work, I've had the pleasure really of spanning agriculture and the environment my whole career. So I grew up as a kid in FFA. I started doing all kinds of large landscape scale conservation management with nonprofits, and so I just straddled that fence my whole life. And so I've always felt that depending on who I'm talking to, I'm either an earth raper or a tree hugger. And it could be within just a couple of minutes of one another that I am perceived that way. And you know what? Those of us who work in this sustainability space, who are generating restoration from our agricultural lands, from our forestry lands, from reclaimed mining lands, that's what we're doing. We're straddling that space. And so it's really a pleasure for me to share this time together with this panel and with you all, thinking about the agriculture industry writ large, the lands and the products that come from it and that entire supply chain, and how that relates to environmental markets. And it really is an exploration together. The team here, the panel, represent a variety of types of expertise across the agricultural industry. We have wonderful folks that are with us in this room as well. So our plan is to spend about 60 minutes as a panel discussing some top issues and questions that we raised amongst one another. So we'll have that dialogue, and then we'll use the last 15 minutes, roughly, to be able to interact directly with you and discuss some of the issues that are on the forefront of your mind and your observations. So that's how we're going to spend our time. I just wanted to give you this context again that we really want to reach broadly across the agriculture space in today's time together. So I'll say that ag production really depends on the perpetual performance of our natural resources, and it's integrally connected with the state of climate and the state of water and biodiversity assets. Our public conservation programs have traditionally focused on incentives for practice implementation. Corporate ag industry sustainability commitments are proliferating, and there are various approaches in play across the broad umbrella of environmental markets. So that could be insetting, supply chain programs, offsetting, blended finance strategies within local communities. So we're glad to have you in this discussion really across the state of agriculture and environmental markets. And so with that, I'm going to ask that each one of our panel members take a couple of minutes to introduce themselves to you, and then we'll move further into dialogue.
All right. Thank you, Jody. Hi, everybody. My name is Kari Cohen. Until about a year ago, I worked at USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service since 2002. And I had 9 different jobs there, and I think about 3 of them were related to environmental markets or conservation finance. One of the first jobs I had, tasks, when I joined the agency in 2002, I wrote or co-wrote a white paper on water quality markets for the agency. This was back in 2002. Through the years, I worked on greenhouse gas markets, some wildlife habitat markets, more water quality markets work. I ran a program called Conservation Innovation Grants, which handed out lots and lots of grants, perhaps to some of the people in this room, to try and stimulate the development and growth of environmental markets nationwide. And then the last 4 or 5 years there at NRCS, I spent running a couple big national programs. One of them was Conservation Innovation Grants. The other was the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, which in August of 2022 received $5 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act. And so I left NRCS just about a year ago, as I said, for lots of different reasons. But while I figure out what to do with the rest of my career, I've just been doing some consulting and spending more time with my son. But I still am interested in environmental markets and do a little work and have a little bit been, engaged from afar, which is interesting and gives me a little bit of a different perspective and maybe allows me to say some different things than I would have if I was still working at USDA.
Hello, everyone. My name is Delane Atsity. I'm the Executive Director of Indian Nations Conservation Alliance, and we're based in Taos, New Mexico. We work with tribes throughout the United States. There's 574 federally recognized tribes, and a lot of the areas that we focus on is 55 million acres of tribal rangeland and 4 million acres of tribal farmlands. So far, we're actively working with 22 of those tribes that are more large land-based, and I'm hoping that we can bring them into this market. But like anything, we're going to have to resolve some trust issues before we move forward with the tribes and try to get some good partnerships for them to work on. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Debbie Reed. I'm the Executive Director of the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium. We're a nonprofit organization. We work solely in the agricultural supply chain to meet the commitments of companies, CPGs, and others to meet their carbon, water, and now increasingly biodiversity commitments and goals. We started in 2019. Our cropping system program is fully validated and certified. We are moving increasingly into livestock production, dairy systems, and as I indicated, biodiversity systems. Based on the conversation this morning about carbon trading markets, we do not work in offset markets. We work solely within value chain, which is different accounting and different reporting than offset markets. It's far more complex, and it is commodity-based, so you have to look at the LCA and the footprint of specific commodities. It's difficult work. We have a lot of member companies putting a lot of money into meeting these commitments, and I will say there's increasing flexibility or desire towards flexibility, and you heard one of the speakers this morning talk about that. In terms of accounting and reporting, that's absolutely necessary. But I think people should be aware that this is a very complex and emerging space. And I do think we'll get to the topic here of, can we better integrate all of the accounting and reporting that companies have to do to meet their volunteer commitments? I think the answer is a resounding yes, we have to. And I would really like to see it, and I'm sure we'll hear about that maybe from Ryan when he speaks.
Good morning. My name is Anna Claire Molizan. I'm originally from Southwest Louisiana, but I've called Colorado my home for the last 25 years. And I have a background. I do not come from the markets world at all. That is the absolute periphery of my kind of role in this industry. I have a background in the social sciences as well as the animal sciences, and I finished up a doctorate in ecosystem science and sustainability. I like science. I work as an independent research scientist. I consider myself a rangeland ecosystem scientist. My area of focus and my expertise is in grazing systems, the interface of livestock and the land, bridging the gap between agriculture and conservation. That's where my research has always focused. And I work through two arms. I have a company called Graze LLC, and I have a nonprofit 501c3 called the Rangeland Living Laboratory. And through those two arms, I collaborate with projects across the country. For example, developing a regenerative beef label for a large cooperative in the Northwest. I'm working on a very large research project in agrivoltaics, where we are looking at grazing systems, carbon fluxes, hydrological patterns on agrivoltaic systems, and in incorporating cattle-compatible designs. That's the new frontier. In addition to sheep, grazing on agrivoltaics. And at the home base, really quickly, I'm a rancher. So I get to not just talk the talk, but I get to walk the walk every day. It's the first thing I do when I wake up in the morning is think about my cattle and my sheep and my horses. So really the first thing on my mind probably after my son, that would be true. But then it's the animals. So I really get to facilitate and translate the bridging science and practice, or science and management. They often speak very different languages, so that's where I find myself. Oh, we're not passing the mic.
Hi. Got it? All right. Hi, everyone. Ryan Smith. I work for Danone. When I say Danone, can I see? Okay. How about Dannon? All right. So I work for Danone North America, where I help lead the regenerative agriculture and climate impact work. Our team has more of a focus on farm and on-farm interventions. We're a 100-year-old dairy company, so some of our brands, Dannon, Oikos, mostly yogurt beverages, so Dannon, Oikos, Light and Fit, Activia, International Delight, and we also dabble in the plant-based, where we own Silk, the plant-based beverage, and So Delicious. So before that, I have worked in government, pseudo-government, nonprofit, worked for a funder, and then I decided to go work for a 100,000 people company, where I saw a lot of potential impact to drive change on farm. So quickly, how we work on Reg Ag, we have been kind of at the soil health, regenerative agriculture pillars, or built those pillars in 2016, 2017, one of the first CPGs to make a large commitment. So we work with our dairy producers alike, currently conventional, non-GMO, across, building that, helping their operations and adapting different interventions. So we're not top down, so we work with our producers that develop self-continuous improvement plans. So they're identifying practices and interventions across manure management, biodiversity, soil health, water, because if it doesn't work for the operation, it doesn't work for us. Where the benefit is within that supply chain, and we'll be talking about insets and et cetera, is we have our contracts. We have about 95% of our contracts are direct with our farms. So any environmental asset that is created on farm, we can keep within that supply chain. That then goes towards our progressive commitments that we've made around greenhouse gas and methane. And we are also an SBTI company, a Science-Based Target Initiative company. We follow the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and then we also have the FLAG guidance, the Forest, Land, and Agricultural Guidance through SBTI. So one important thing I want to say, we have a multi-million-dollar initiative to support these farms through their adoption of regenerative ag and climate smart impact, but then we're also looking on how we leverage those dollars through external funds. So we're a big partner on the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities, a Conservation Innovation Grant, and RCPP. And just to be very clear, not a dime of that comes to Danone. It's passed through to our farms. We're just helping pass that financial assistance and providing technical assistance to our farms. So excited for this conversation, and guess we can dig in.
Well, thank you to each one of you. And so just for a little bit more framing or context, I wanted to, again, say we have a breadth of expertise here, and that's on purpose. And it is all related to the broad banner of environmental markets. And so for project developers, there are multiple places to intersperse, all right, with technical expertise within this breadth, with figuring out how to blend funds together for these initiatives, thinking about this at a program level or a watershed level approach to certain communities' needs really across water, carbon, and biodiversity. And so there really is, there are multiple entry points to participating in these marketplaces, and here we're focusing on within the ag industry. And I also want to recognize, in addition to the economic values of, where are there opportunities for business or bringing additional revenues to landowners and farmers, it's the ecological value and the social value. And so I know, Anna Claire, you said you wanted to bring up some of your experience and thoughts about what this means from the landowner and land manager perspective as well in terms of the social sciences. And we don't want to leave that out. And so I wanted to give a little bit of context that globally, we're really seeing from the food and beverage industry, those companies that have their foot in multiple countries, they're moving with really the intent that many of these biodiversity, water, and climate commitments are going to become more and more formalized. And so we're seeing them shift toward really what direction is happening in the EU countries, and they're expecting it to, at some point, be a compliance marketplace. And I just put that in context to recognize that like some of the companies we talk about here, if they're global in nature, that's the direction they're moving in their corporate strategies. If it's a national company here in the U.S. Or regional or more locally based, then they may not be yet moving in that direction in their standards and strategies. And there's a little bit more adaptability potentially for practice-based programs and locally structured opportunities. So just keep an eye to what's happening at the high end there. I also kind of wanted to bring our attention to the U.S. Footprint for agriculture and really the land base we're working from to produce restoration and food products from. And so I'm going to draw a few facts from a publication from last year that includes a colleague of ours, Dr. Daniel Perkins with Creekbank Associates, called the Shrinking Land Challenge. So just to give some context to the land base, the realty we're expecting to do this on. So there are 2.3 billion acres of land in the U.S. Within that, 29% of that is range grazing land, pretty much permanently in range and grazing use. 28% of that is forest. 17% of that is cropland. 14% would be considered special use. That's roads, that's parks, those kinds of infrastructure. 3% is urban, even though I know we always feel like the cities are growing. And 9% would be considered other. And so when we look at shifts in land uses from that kind of base, and we have a population that has grown by a factor of 10 over the past 150 years, we have a growing owner versus tenant dynamics in our rural land base, which does affect what can be done and how long those actions take place. So we want to recognize that owner versus tenant dynamic. Land speculation has significantly increased the value of farmlands. I want to recognize that 96% of cropland overlaps with the range of our current Endangered Species Act listed species. So consider that. We also have situations at the federal and state level where there's potential, and in some cases this has already come into policy, banning of foreign investment in U.S. farmland, particularly in the Southwest, where it's really been a scenario of exporting water. So if you're growing a lot of alfalfa, if that alfalfa is owned by an entity outside of the U.S. because they need to grow their alfalfa for their needs, we're actually really exporting our water in that process in very arid situations. And the financial margins, we don't want to leave that out, and we want to really bring that into the dialogue about what is the function of ecosystem services and the monetization in that within this structure. And so and I'll ask the folks to bring in an Eastern and a Western and a Southern context as well in terms of arid lands, public land allotments, and the relationship of public and private lands, especially in the grazing context. So with that, we're going to turn to a set of questions and work our way through it. And, I may call on one of you or another explicitly. But let's begin with this integration. So Debbie, you mentioned, right, we're going to start to talk about how can we link things together. Let me ask you all, is it important and is it possible for programs to incorporate conservation and restoration of multiple natural resource assets, water, carbon, other greenhouse gases, biodiversity, and beyond listed species, let's say? So is that important? Is it possible? And then in what ways are your programs and approaches considering this? And so at this point, I'll open it up. Does anybody want to launch into that?
I'm happy to. So the answer, as I indicated previously, is yes. I would say one of the challenges we have currently is that companies have standards and guidance that they have to adhere to and be very transparent about it in terms of how they account for and report annually any mitigation opportunities they undertake. The guidance for carbon and greenhouse gases is different than the guidance for water, is different than the guidance for nature and biodiversity, and they all are using different spatial scales. That's a problem, right? We have this artificial construct in the carbon space called supply sheds. So wherever Danone supplies their milk from, that is their supply shed. It's an amorphous concept. There's no agreement on how you define a supply shed, but a company has to report according to their supply shed for where they source and make sure they're mitigating there. Then we have in the water world, watersheds, which are natural constructs and make a lot of sense for us in terms of a boundary within which we can operate and do accounting and reporting. But then for nature and biodiversity, there are things like flyways and pathways that mammals follow, right? So we have very different spatial constructs. So a company can't do accounting and reporting in one common scale. So we are actually advocating to the standards and to companies and to everyone else. Let's pause. We've learned a lot in the past 5 years doing scope 3 carbon and greenhouse gas accounting. And maybe we should be working from a different spatial scale. Maybe it's the watershed scale, maybe it's a jurisdictional scale, and do accounting and reporting in an integrated fashion for all of those things. Now, our organization does that because when you go out and you collect data that is needed for accounting and reporting, you can collect a lot of data with the partners, the producers that you're working with in an integrated fashion. And for instance, there's a lot of overlap between the data you collect for carbon and the data you collect for water. So yes, we should integrate. We should rethink the spatial scales, and the standards in particular should rethink the spatial scales. And then we can bring in all of our partners, producers on the ground, as well as communities within which they operate, public and private sector, to do all of this in a more integrated fashion, and bring in social elements. Right now, the constructs are different spatially, and it's making it incredibly complicated.
I'll jump on the note of scale, too. So in rangeland science, spatial and temporal scale is the crux of any of our abilities to interpret and extrapolate research into practice. It's a very huge challenge. I wanted to link that and also say that in terms of integrating diverse aspects into markets or into programming, biodiversity, carbon, water. This is something that I feel very strongly about as an ecosystem scientist, is that the reductionistic history of our way of creating land management regulations, as well as just studying land, is very reductionistic, and I think that we miss the systems perspective. So I think absolutely we have to look at it all. We have to look at water. We have to look at all of the trophic levels, from the microbiome all the way up to the apex, carnivore, and understand how the system is working. Because if you pull one lever, it's the metaphor of the spider web, right? If you tap one thread on a spider web, the entire web shifts. And I believe that is what ecology is all about, and that's how we have to look at these things. Similar to in agrivoltaic systems, I talk a lot with solar developers who think of their lands as just kind of something to get through the permitting process, the swift, regulations, and then let's produce energy. But whenever you build something like that on a landscape, you become a land steward and a natural resource manager. And so to think of any of these projects as a whole ecosystem, eco means home, I think is absolutely essential.
Just to add a couple points here, I think to Debbie's point, I think that's something as a company that we're challenged with, because we have made some very robust initiatives and claims around greenhouse gas and around carbon, right? And that's, I don't know if there's any other CPGs in the room, but I think we're all challenged with that. And then how do we work in these other ecosystem benefits? And to Debbie's point, I think what we're challenged with is you're looking at different standards, different methodologies on how we measure impact, right? So, and I'm speaking to a bunch of experts, but if you look 10 years ago, we could count the methodologies and the registries on one hand, and now it's like, I can't keep up, right? So we definitely take a systems approach, and in Danone, we, of course, we value water quality and quantity. We value biodiversity. We're just figuring out how we can integrate that into our current standards and how that works, across operations.
Great. Okay, so I'm gonna anyone else, or I'll move on to our next question. Okay, so and Delane, I was looking at you here. Okay, so no, I'm gonna ask you a fresh one here, because you brought up trust and relationships earlier. So I would like you to talk about this, and then bring in some other contributors as well. But so I've worked in the nonprofit sector. You also have a couple of hats that you wear. I've worked with so many public servants, and then also now in the private sector. And so, how do you see these three sectors contributing in the agriculturally based environmental restoration, environmental markets space? Okay, this has a couple steps to it, right? But how do these three sectors interact with your programs? And if they're not fully interacting, which ways do you want to bring them in? And how does trust and clear outcomes factor into that, in your experience?
Okay. So, I believe that there are trust issues with the tribes. It started from the beginning of the reservation system and the creation of all that, that type of system. But, as we move forward, a lot of the tribes ended up in extraction, kind of victims of extraction over the years, whether it's uranium or coal or oil and gas. And a lot of those are starting to terminate on tribal reservations. They're going more green, And so that's leading to an opportunity in this market. And so what we're doing with my organization is preparing them for that opportunity. And so right now we're trying to find the right partners that won't take advantage of them, and that they can start to build that trust with. And the opportunity is huge, And so, I think right now there's a lot of nonprofits in that area that are starting to generate work with tribes, but eventually we can start to build on that. Most of the government programs that work at the tribal level, they're not working. A lot of these USDA programs aren't working for tribes. Some of the NRCS and FSA and all that, that's not helping our producers. A lot of it has to do with the land still belonging as a federal trust land. It's not true ownership by the producers. So that's where we kind of run into that issue. And so if we could get more, private money and that in the mix, I think that will help everybody. Yeah.
Okay, before I open that up, I guess I wanted to ask, can you describe a little bit more about some of the types of, and there are a variety of members within the alliance and land uses, but as you said, they're extractive activities in terms of from the mineral, grazing, around the country. Can you give us a sense of the types of land uses, and because that brings into what are the opportunities for restoration and those private dollars on tribal lands?
Yeah, so I mentioned 55 million acres of tribal rangeland. So the number one commodity that tribes generate is livestock. I know, according to the Indian Ag Census from a few years ago, there was approximately 226,000 head of cattle, and so that's the number one commodity. And the reason I keep referring it to as a commodity, most of those livestock go to the border towns for sales, and there's never hardly any value-added processes, or they don't forward contract a lot of that. So there's an opportunity there. And what I'm hoping with this is that we can start to stack all of these value-added and incentives. So it's just like the non-native ranchers, only 2% of them are making a profit at ranching. And I think with the tribal ranchers, it's even worse because of the distance to get supplies and to reduce their expenses. But that's where one area, and then the other area where they can participate is these farms. I was recently on the board of directors for a 110,000 acre tribal farm with 526,000 acre feet of water rights, and we have 700 pivots, and we're just at the starting phase of doing regenerative ag there because it's been operated at a commercial level for 50 plus years. So we're starting to build the foundation, especially with the organization that I run. We're trying to work with tribal ranchers and farmers to build a foundation so they can start to create their own business on.
Thank you for that additional insight into the land use and the parties working hard there. So I'm going to go back to that question about the multi-sector, right? And a few of you touched on it earlier, and Ryan, you brought up, right? It's a blending of funding. But if you can share some insights with everyone here about your experiences building trust and building bridges and where you've run into roadblocks working across the sectors to do and advance supply chain initiatives, whatever kind of conservation enhancement, whether voluntary or from a regulatory perspective, it would be helpful for us.
Oh, me? Okay. Well, yeah. I may put a little bit different spin on this, and what I mean by that is, of course, when we're working with our farm producers or any farm producer across the agricultural landscape, they need to see the value of developing that environmental asset, right? So it could be thinking about the environmental asset as its own commodity, or how does that environmental asset move with a commodity through the supply chain? And that's where we get really excited about that opportunity, because then we can pass that to retailers or downstream value chain partners where, and I'm not claiming we do this yet, but where we can say, well, this is a low carbon milk, or this is a water friendly grain, something like that, right? But to do that, I think the challenge is, we have to show the value of that. We have to build premiums. We have to build markets. And while I love our friends at USDA and NRCS, I think there is a challenge there, because sometimes we're only thinking about what's actually happening in field and the interventions in field, as opposed to sometimes putting a lot of effort in, okay, how do we build up processing opportunities, processors, right? We don't necessarily need special processing equipment to process a climate smart commodity or a regenerative ag commodity, but we need that to drive that supply, right? So think that's some of the challenges we're running into. And, farmers are looking for premiums. If they're saying, well, I'm changing this intervention, we're adding this, what's the opportunity for me to develop that asset, not only for the opportunity then, but for the entire supply chain and value chain.
Thank you. I like your twist on that. Anyone else want to comment there? Kari?
Well, I was just going to say, I'm going to speak a little bit about greenhouse gas markets because it seems to be the thing that's hot right now. But so the last 2 years, right, USDA has received billions, 10 billion, 15 billion if you start looking at forestry as well as agriculture, to sort of stimulate climate smart agriculture activities, greenhouse gas markets. And I like to say there's no better time to be USDA if you're working in greenhouse gases. And there's no better time to be a partner looking to get funding from USDA to do greenhouse gas related things. And there's no better time to be a supply chain company looking for the federal government to subsidize what you're trying to do with your supply chain. No value judgment there, Ryan. But I think there is some question still about, is this a better time to be reducing greenhouse gases from agriculture or sequestering carbon in an agricultural setting? I don't know that we know that answer. I think there's still so much uncertainty in the science. Anna mentioned science. There's a lot of uncertainty in the tools. And a lot of the money that's going out through partnerships for climate smart commodities that Ryan mentioned earlier is going out for things like cover crops, crop rotations, reduced tillage, where the science is still out, I think, on really what the benefits are across the country, across all soil types, across all sectors and crops. And so, I think it's great. Ryan said, Debbie and I met each other 15 years ago or something when she was running the Coalition on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases, small group of people, couple registries working on things, and now there's this panoply of registries, organizations. There's for-profit entities paying farmers for their greenhouse gas reductions or modeled greenhouse gas reductions. And I just wonder whether we're at a place now where we can say with any more certainty that we're helping farmers actually do good in a greenhouse gas markets context. If you're a farmer and you got 20 different partnerships for climate smart commodities grant awardees like knocking on your door being, hey, will you participate in our project? They're all offering you different amounts of money to do slightly different things. Like as a farmer, I don't know how you deal with that or address that. So I think we're in a little bit of a confusing time. I don't know if we're in a better time. Again, if certain people are better off, probably certain organizations. From a greenhouse gas climate perspective, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in. I think one thing so I have been working in these markets since the 90s in many different capacities, always in the agricultural sector. Back in the 90s, there was a lot of deserved mistrust towards these markets from farmers who signed contracts with companies who paid them for things and then were able to resell them in secondary and tertiary markets, carbon markets included, right? I think what has changed in the current context and working with companies in the supply chain is that companies who find that their own ability to continue to be successful know that there's a huge risk coming from agriculture that is a business and outdoors, that is subject to the vagaries of weather and climate and drought and flooding. These companies are putting a lot of money into ensuring that the producers in their supply chain are more resilient. That is a huge change from carbon markets of 20 and 25 years ago. Companies, 10 years ago, I talked to a lot of companies who did not want to put $1 into what they were doing. I'm not saying all of them, but many of them. And there are still some big box retailers who do not want to pay for this. But most companies, Danone and a lot of other companies recognize to continue to exist, they need to be more resilient by making sure their farmers are more resilient. And they are paying farmers and ranchers to become more resilient through regenerative agricultural practices. So that to me is a big shift. Whether or not USDA's programs are directed in the right direction, whether or not they're doing appropriate quantification, that's a different discussion. But I would tell you that the work that the companies have to do to account and report requires a lot of robustness, and we are learning a lot through those programs. And the fact that we can now think about integrating other ecological impacts and be science-based is to me huge. We have a market program and we have a research program, and we work with a lot of land-grant universities and others on improving quantification. So I think there is a lot still to be gained by continuing to invest in that, but we have learned a lot. We do know we're moving in the right direction, but I'll tell you, we find out all the time that some of the practices we're paying for, sometimes we actually increase emissions. If you overapply manure, for instance, right? So, but you do have to have the right quantification tools to understand those dynamics. But the good news is we all recognize we have to work with farmers and ranchers, meet them where they are, give them the tools, the skill sets, the technical assistance, and the money to make the changes to become more resilient.
If I can just respond real fast, I think you're right, Debbie. And what I didn't say is that cover crops, okay, maybe we don't know if they always have a greenhouse gas benefit, but for sure they probably have a soil health benefit, a water quantity benefit. Maybe you're helping make that operation more resilient. I think the resilience piece is huge, right? Adaptation, absolutely need to help the country's farmers and ranchers figure out how to adapt to what's happening to them in a changing climate. I'm just talking about strictly in a greenhouse gas context and the money that we're spending, and are we spending on the right things? I think that's a separate question than, I mean, a lot of the stuff that is on the USDA's list of climate smart practices have benefits beyond the greenhouse gas benefits or supposed greenhouse gas benefits. They might have, pollinator benefits. There's definitely probably water quality benefits in a lot of these practices. So I think there's ecosystem-wide considerations that in many ways probably outweigh the greenhouse gas benefits that, we may not even fully understand at this point.
Can I just say one thing? So I agree, and I just wanted to, I wrote some numbers down a couple weeks ago about efficiency gains from this on farm, because again, when we talk to farms about greenhouse gas benefits in these markets, it's an entry point. And this is very high level. Don't ask me any more deeper questions because I probably, but from a reg ag benefit, from a system perspective, some farms are seeing 30% increase in yields, right? During times of extreme weather, 63% less water runoff. So that's water infiltration that's being kept. And I think this is a big one that most farms that are adopting regenerative ag practices are seeing 6.3% organic matter compared to a 3.5% organic matter on conventional operations. So that's, I think, a huge value that farms are seeing from these dollars that are being inserted from these environmental market and asset programs.
Great. Oh, this is exciting. Now we're going to go even into some more touchy situations here, because I like to do that, and we need to probe in some of these areas. So it's kind of a combo question around the state of environmental science and how that relates in its application of market-based programs. And so I would like you all to weigh in on pay for practice versus pay for performance types of programs for a bit. And so across the environmental market space, it could be a pay for practice where you're really judging or evaluating, is the practice implemented at the way we anticipated it, versus the measuring certain things, and then you get into specifically measurement of greenhouse gas, soil carbon sequestration. And what's the best way to tackle this? Is it one way or the other? Should we only do pay for practice programs, which historically really has come out of a lot of public funding programs, but there are also private and NGO programs that offer rewards or incentives for practice-based approaches. Then there's this performance-based, and what are the risks for a landowner? What are the risks from a corporate perspective? Will you get what you promised and what you hope you are paying for? So let's talk about that, and what insights can you share about how producers relate to these different approaches, right? And so I'd like to start there with how do you sense that producers respond to these different approaches, and then we'll dig a little deeper.
I'll go ahead and start off. So I think the producers are set in the ways that they've been doing it for years, and I think you got to meet them halfway and start the pay for practice, and then as they start to fine tune their management and improve upon it, eventually I could see the pay performance kicking in.
I agree that these they go hand in hand, and I think they need to be coupled always. I think that ranchers, especially in the grazing space, I work more with ranchers than farmers, but I think it's similar that the tie to the everyday actions is what is meaningful for them, and someone that and I'm talking in terms of buy-in, getting folks on board and partnering and collaborating with these programs. Someone that I regard very highly in the ranching space, his name is Jack Southworth. He's up in Oregon, and Jack has a way with words, and he says that programs to change kind of hearts and minds and actions of ranchers have to be measurable. And that could be observational measurement, but also data. So it has to be measurable. It has to be doable. So it just has to work logistically with the operation. Operationally, it needs to be doable or feasible. And then finally, he says that it needs to be meaningful. And I think that's where the performance-based side is that. That measurable piece, but the doable and the meaningful is the practice, and that's why ranchers do what they do. They love the practice, they love the day-to-day, and so if you are pitching a program or a collaboration and they don't find true meaning, and I don't mean monetary, because that's probably one of the bottom values, to tell you the truth. And research has shown us that monetary value is not as important as other, such as intrinsic value, relational values of their work and what they do, and what they feel is their purpose in life. So measurable, doable, meaningful, especially meaningful.
And that's no bull.
No bull.
So I just wanted to add a little bit here too from that angle, from a project developer perspective. Compliance project developers who are looking to also bring in the voluntary market space on their land base and with lessors and partners, or in the voluntary market space, folks did a great panel speaking yesterday on the carbon marketplace and the programs they're developing. I just want to encourage that maybe it's not one versus the other. That there are reasons to have performance and practice-based programs, and to figure out what best fits for those audiences, and how that is designed in as a project developer. I think we saw a lot of folks go really heavy into performance-based programs and looking at those global standards, when there may be a number of shorter supply chains, mid-sized companies, national companies that it may be more appropriate for them at this point in the voluntary greenhouse gas space to support practice-based programs. So I just wanted to lay that out. I don't think it's one or the other. We need to keep an open mind.
Yeah, one thing I'd add to that. So we are all outcomes-based, and we started our projects in 2019. And for me, one of the holy grails is that we now have a treasure trove of data that we're starting to do analytics on, 5 years worth of data on soil carbon quantification, and we've done some pretty intensive soil carbon sampling. And we all know there's no one size fits all, and not every practice works in every place. You do not want to do cover crops in the Pacific Northwest, right? And so, but we're able to actually put data behind that and put numbers behind that in terms of soil carbon removal, emission reductions, whether it's nitrous oxide or methane, link it to actual practices and systems, because no farmer practice is just practice, right? It's a systems. So we're starting now, we're able to really report out some quantified outcomes and where we're seeing great trends. And that is important information for producers, right? Because producers don't want to just try something that could impact their yields for a year or 2 years or 3 years, right? They want to know, what does the data show, particularly in my region, particularly for my type of production system. So to me, that's a value add if you're actually quantifying, to be able to do those analytics and look back over time.
I'll just say quickly, I've long been a pay-for-performance evangelist from an efficiency standpoint. I think agriculture is really hard in that context. If you look across any industry, you're probably going to be have an easier time paying for performance, whether it's trying to reduce your kilowatts in the energy industry, or go to solar, or reduce nutrient outflow at the end of a wastewater pipe, whether you can measure. Every farm is different, slopes are different, soils are different, weather regimes are different. Stochastic events have a huge impact on water quality changes. And I think what Debbie said is awesome. I think we need more information, we need more data, we need more technology, we need more tools, we need more science. I just think when you're going farm to farm, ranch to ranch, the transaction costs get really high, really fast. When you're talking about smaller amounts of money that you're paying a producer in a water quality market or a greenhouse gas market. So it's really, really challenging. Not to say we shouldn't do it, and people are doing it right now using models that may or may not work that well. I think that's fine to test these things and really try to put things on the ground and see if they work. But I think it's just really hard, complex agroecological systems that are just really hard to get in, wrap your hands around in a pay-for-performance context.
Sorry, can I? So this is improving, but even with a pay-for-performance, as many know, in the past it's been annual, right? And I think we're improving kind of commitments and contracts, but that's a challenge for a farmer as well, right? Depending on extreme weather and et cetera. To Debbie's point, 1 year you'll have a good year, 1 year you have a bad year. But I want to come from this from a specifically a dairy perspective, and when we're talking about, let's just pull out methane. Some of the interventions to reduce methane are quite expensive. So capital expenditures, equipment. So manure solid separators, separating the water from the solids, have huge greenhouse gas impact and methane impact, but we're talking upwards of $1 million. And these are larger farms. And so if you did an outcome-based transaction for that practice, and the farm is looking at, okay, how do I recoup my dollars from this practice? It may be 5 years, and that's could be 5 or 6 years, but debt's still debt, right? To anybody. So even if you have a commitment saying you're going to get that back. So from Danone's perspective, we actually look at it both, and we look at those. So sometimes we do pay for a practice to get it installed, so we can have that commitment and we know it's going to be there for 20 years, right? So just wanted to throw that out. It's really looking at what those capital expenditures are and what your ultimate benefit is and what system you want to approach.
I think too, a point that you touched on was about fit and context. So, for example, I was working in Hawaii, and the worst rancher in Hawaii is going to have organic carbon, soil carbon that blows anyone with the best regenerative practices in the United States out of the water. So just that the heterogeneity across rangeland ecosystems, across soil types, I really encourage anyone who is working in this space of developing projects and incentives to think or have flexibility in the program, or have many diverse programs that can really achieve success in diverse regions. Soil carbon and arid landscapes, of course, soil carbon sequestration is very slow to none, and then you have a drought, and so when rangeland science looks at research with any conclusivity, the minimum is a 10-year longitudinal study. I mean, ideally we would have 25-year studies. There are some ARS stations that have 75-year studies. That's where you kind of start to understand finally. So again, temporal and spatial scales is just key. So any kind of programming that is pigeonholing a very short time frame, or very kind of reductionistic look at the cycling of nutrients, water, energy in the system is not gonna maybe have the long-term promises. The promises will be hard to keep.
And that's why we need a 50-year farm bill, not a 5-year farm bill.
Well, and that's the thing about the Climate Smart Commodity Program, is the first question that I get from any rancher is, okay, these services are amazing. I'm learning so much. I love the data that's, that is coming at no cost to me in this program. But what do I do when the grant runs out? Then what? And so, thinking of collaboration across public and private sectors, nonprofits, and how do we support each other and keep the services ongoing when one kind of runs out, another one can kind of continue on? How do you plan ahead?
Oh, well, interestingly, that is my next question, Anna Claire. Yes. So we're going to try to do this pretty rapidly here, panel, because we want to bring in the fine folks here in the room. So try to keep your response super brief, rapid round. Crystal ball forecast for the next 5 years. I think you said something about 5 years, Ryan, right? So looking ahead for 5 years, and I'm going to narrow this down to just corporate ag, food and beverage companies. Which way are they headed in their market solution strategies for sustainability? Supply chains, insetting, offsetting? Are they going to change their commitments? Like, what do you see happening in the next 5 years? Quick.
I'll just say quickly, I don't know, but I do think it is a little bit interesting to look at what's happening in Europe, right? A lot of these are multinational companies. Europe is in an upheaval right now in addressing greenhouse gases from agriculture. They're now, again, looking at potentially doing a cap and trade system just within agriculture because of farmer protests when they try to make people do things. I think what happens on our shores may not be as relevant as what is happening in Europe when it comes to these big multinationals and how they try to go about doing this stuff.
Well, I think there'll be
He was out there thinking about
yeah, I was. I think there's, they'll be reaching out to more of the producers more, but I also think that there's not going to be a huge difference in their management, with the resources that they have. I don't see it. It's not a lot of this rangeland. It's not going to convert overnight. It's going to take many years to do that, and that might be the frustrating part.
We've seen trends towards more companies taking on commitments, and companies with commitments continuing their commitments and increasing them because they have to, basically. Shareholders, stakeholders, customers, clients are all demanding that they do this. That will continue, and I do think we will continue to see more integration and hopefully public-private partnerships so that the impacts are longer lasting, to your point.
I see lots of conversation kind of gaining momentum around co-benefits, and I think the speaker this morning emphasized that as well. So co-benefits, and as well as I working with farmers and ranchers, a distrust in the offset programs. So I am seeing skepticism in offset programs, and perhaps insetting and like value added kind of within a chain, those programs may be gaining more attention and buy-in.
Ditto. So public-private partnerships, but also private partnerships, if I could say that. And just an example, companies like ourselves and other companies are looking at value chain partnerships upstream and downstream, how we're working with suppliers, how we're working with retailers, to bring more dollars to the table, but also in line with SBTI commitments and the insetting. And we won't get into the whole offsetting that was brought up in SBTI. I don't think anyone has the answers on that right now, but essentially how companies can co-claim and co-share values, I think is really going to, kind of be an added value.
Thank you all, and great job on that. And so we want to open it up. We have about 13 minutes, and we have two wonderful supporting room monitors. So Karen and Shaw, one or the other, will come over. And if you are wanting to ask a question of a specific person, please go ahead and name them so we know how to respond efficiently.
Thank you. My name is my name is Bill Lucas, and I'm in the nutrient removal providers space. And this is really great stuff about regenerative agriculture and greenhouse gases, but I haven't seen any discussion on the elephant in the room, which is water degradation from cropping, okay? That is the hugest problem in the Gulf of Mexico, Lake Erie, the Chesapeake Bay, Florida, and we're starting to see nutrient trading in Virginia and in Florida, just passed the law. But I would like to see considerably more effort involved in that. And so this is directed largely at Carrie and as well as Ryan. What do you see in the future? Because farmers don't make enough money to install these what are called BMPs, but they're really control measures. So I work with pay for performance, where systems are rigorously monitored, which doesn't cost that much, for wastewater bolt-ons, for instance. There's no reason why you couldn't do a regional ag runoff treatment system in a similar manner, but that has to be funded somehow. And so in the Chesapeake Bay, I wrote the BMP model for Prince George's County, and we came up with $220 million just to reduce and meet that 1 TMDL in PG County, when that amount of money spent upstream in Pennsylvania Piedmont would have done incredibly more amounts of removal. So what I'm looking into is A, addressing the issue, and B, addressing trading, and that's really what I was hoping to hear from here. But at any rate, enough long-winded.
I'll just say real fast. I mean, so as I said, I was in on water quality markets early 2000s. I put out grants through USDA programs we built water quality markets all over the country, or water quality trading programs, I should say. And then nothing really happened. Virginia has, a decent stormwater trading program. But when I was thinking about this panel, I was thinking greenhouse gases, biodiversity markets are hot now. Water quality, like it kind of just faded. And maybe Mark Kaiser or Alec or someone in the room that knows better about this stuff than me has a sense of if that is actually not true, or it's just my impression. But transaction costs were high. The difficulty in measuring or modeling the nutrient reduction is really challenging. I don't know. Ryan, you got thoughts?
I was just going to add, I was going to come from a different perspective of talking about what the removal system is, but how do we work further upstream to educate farmers that you don't have to put so many nutrients, you know, on your crops, right? Or the 4 R's, people familiar with the right time, the right place, like really adopting that more than like, yes, we're always going to have some over appliers, and how do we talk about the removal system, but how do we work more upstream with farmers to reduce nutrient application even before we get to that point, I think is something we're all still trying to figure out. As we all know, nutrients just don't sit in the soil as a reserve, right? We know that's a myth. So I think there's a lot of new technologies, a lot of new applications out there. I even heard about a new corn variety that actually grows 30%, or has, instead of 7 or 9 feet, it actually grows at like 4 or 5 feet. That gives opportunity for farmers to actually, you know, get in at the right time to apply nutrients. So it's kind of looking at it from both perspectives.
So I'll just add a quick comment here, and I appreciate you elevating the topic of water quality. And so in that market context, it almost becomes like a program, state level advocacy effort to build out that trading framework and a mechanism for exchange, and then have your program in place for farmer activities to benefit, receive payment for that. But it's at a municipal level oftentimes. And so looking at that at the local level, you're really going to have to look at your NGOs in some ways to leverage the development of that, to access potentially federal funding and start to facilitate the exchange. But we're making some progress there in some additional states as well. So with that, we'll take a next question.
Alec Eccles, Campbell Foundation. I really do have a question. Just let me get to it for just a second. So before I became a hack, I was a scientist. I was really thrilled to hear the discussion about taking a systems approach for science, ecosystems, ecology, water quality, climate. We've got to take a broader ecosystem service approach to the sciences we use, and we're not using the dismal science nearly enough, and that's one of the reasons that our NRCS programs are failing. So I'm going to throw out a couple of factoids. Every time you drove a plow through a field, on average, you lose about 1.5 tons of carbon. The most efficient way to put carbon back in the soil is not trees, and everybody loves to plant trees, and again, this is on average, but it's dense stem vegetation, grasses and forbs. We're not investing in those. So my question is, how do we make better use of systems that farmers are going to relate to deliver this water quality and greenhouse gas reduction, as opposed to things that overwhelm them, that aren't accessible, that are so opaque that you never get to the market?
So I really like the focus on understanding ag is one example of an organization who's looking at regenerative practices on very large scales and looking at it as soil, total soil health, right? And so if we implement some of the principles of regenerative agriculture, like keep the soil covered, which means don't plow, right? Which means we're not going to lose carbon. So keep the soil covered, maintain living roots, support biodiversity, integrate herbivores. What are the other 2 I'm missing? Anyway, there are 6 basic principles, and 4 of the 6 really have to do with overall soil health. And so I think if we look at soil health as a basis and something that is very tangible in terms of practice, modifying practices, then we're doing lots of other co-benefiting kind of actions at the same time without even meaning to do it. So that's one approach that I think is tangible for landowners and managers to kind of grab and have concrete actions to work with. But as well, looking at ecological systems, I'm working on a project in Georgia, and in Georgia, keeping the soil covered is not hard. You actually have too much, kind of overgrowth and things in the understory of timber. And so, but then out in Colorado where I am, keeping the soil covered is something that you really have to work for, and that it's easy to lose that cover if you're overgrazing or if you're plowing or even any kind of tillage. So again, the context, right, of the ecological system comes into play.
I think another way is to reward them for their production. You know, instead of biting commodity commercialized beef, which we're used to. You know, we're used to the couple dollar hamburgers. You know, reward them for their efforts and their sustainability into the future.
I also think we need electric tractors. Not even kidding. I mean, what a use case for an electric vehicle. They're driving it near their home often. You can charge it every night. From a greenhouse gas perspective, I can't think of a better way from the agriculture industry. And the trucks that are moving agricultural products, electrify those. I think you're going to do a lot better than covering the ground. And cover crops, again, cover crops great from an agroecology system perspective, but maybe not so much greenhouse gases.
I think the thing I would say is like we're often coming at this from a reductionist and reactionary approach, right? And really working with farmers and ranchers who understand the land and understand how to work the land, right? As opposed to we need to reduce carbon, we need to reduce greenhouse gases, right? There's a huge focus right now on removing animals and protein, right, because of the greenhouse gas footprint. But you cannot remove the hooves from the land and retain all of the ecological assets of grasslands and rangelands and pasture lands. You lose all of that. You lose the water filtration, you lose the recreational, you lose everything that goes with it. So the reductionist and reactionary approach to let's get rid of livestock, right, because they have a big greenhouse gas footprint. I think we just need to move away from that and get back to agroecology and what people are doing on the land.
Brian Kreutzberg, Oregon DEQ. And to the previous questioner, we do have a robust water quality trading program in the state of Oregon. I think my question is mainly for Anna, having to do with the social science aspects of restoration. I always talk about positive mental health outcomes during my talks about water quality trading, that's a benefit. I guess the first part of my question is, what other dimensions other than mental health are there in the social sciences? And getting back to your Jack Southworth quote, how do we measure the value of that and communicate it to people?
Awesome. This is great. Thank you for bringing the social dimension in. In my opinion, it's really all about people. And it's going to make or break anything we do, the health of the people. And so to give a couple anecdotes, in one project, what can we do or what are we doing? One aspect of a project that I'm working on is to create a peer-to-peer learning network. So the Country Natural Beef out there in your neck of the woods is a partner in this project, and so we have spent a year developing a peer-to-peer learning network. So peer-to-peer learning networks it's a thing all over that's global, and it's been studied, and it's the idea that we learn best from the inside out in our social networks. So we learn best from our neighbors, our family members, and even more so than when we have experts sitting on a stage, right? So how do we create and support those frameworks, those peer-to-peer networks? And that's what we are working on piloting. We launched it this year. And so far, we've had an incredible response. We meet quarterly. Each group meets quarterly. And the ranchers are clumped in groups regionally. So they share the same environment. They share the same political atmosphere. They share some of the same natural disaster challenges when they happen and things like that. And And there are huge benefits. It's kind of, well, a long time ago, I worked at a feed store, and the old timers would come around to the feed store to fill up their trucks, right, in the morning, grab a cup of coffee, and I used to love sitting behind the counter and just listening to them chatting. But that doesn't happen anymore. The coffee chat at the feed store, I mean, when was the last time you saw that? You witnessed that, in a community. So we're kind of recreating that space. So peer-to-peer networks, and that's in the kind of practice-based space. But in the research, there is, I'm part of the Society for Range Management, and there is a committee that has recently formed around the social ecological systems and social ecological research. And there was a recent special issue of Rangelands, if it's Googleable. So the journal Rangelands is meant for a wide audience, not just scientists talking to scientists, but also with folks with boots on the ground. And they did a special issue that kind of encapsulated like the last, 5 or 7 years of social science research in rangeland ecology and management. So that's a very eye-opening set of papers. In my personal research, we actually just yesterday, it was published. So if you look at, if you Google Seeking Common Ground and my last name, I think it'll probably come up. We conducted a study looking at sociocultural, I'm sorry, this is a long answer to your question, but so earlier I was talking about how monetary value is not number one usually in inducing change and especially practice change. But sociocultural values of ranchers and farmers are very strong drivers of action and decision making. And so we conducted a study around this, around looking at the sociocultural kind of value clusters of ranchers, as well as collaborative land managers, such as public land agencies, wildlife biologists, the nonprofits, and also recreationers, folks who go and ride their bikes on public lands. So we surveyed through a particular methodology for sociocultural valuation, and we kind of mapped that across value types. And that was very eye-opening. It's a method that is not a very expensive research method to execute. And I feel like if we did more social research in this industry, we would learn a lot more about how to be successful and pathways for success. So, yeah.
I'm so glad you brought all that to bear here at the end, because we're doing it because we are humans, because we need a good place to be, and we need to take care of our nest, and we can do that through multiple strategies, but it's because we choose to do it that we enact it. I want to thank you all for being here, for the great discussion, and really a big thank you to each of our panel members, and then I'm going to let you go. So thank you all, and have a great day, and come up and visit with us.